myself though.
I was like,
Okay,
oop.
everybody, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. We have a nice big group. We're at about our average number right now, so we're going to get rolling. Wonderful to see your faces. Everybody, please turn your camera on when you're talking if you can, because we'd love to see you. And we're going to keep everybody muted during this so that the content is coherent. And well organized and everybody can follow along. But so go ahead and use that raise your hand feature if you need to say something or have questions. In the meantime, I wanted to introduce our guest speaker today. His name is James Sinclair, and he is a research associate in the Center on Human Development in the Special Education Program at the University of Oregon. So we are really lucky to have him with us today to talk about a topic that is super important, very near and dear to my heart. When James and I were planning for this, I told him a little story and we thought maybe I should tell it at the beginning of this, and I'll keep it really quick. But I know we're not supposed to have favorite students as teachers and practitioners, but I definitely had a favorite student who was in trouble all of the time and in my room all of the time. And at one point had told me that my classroom was the only place that they felt safe in the school. And I got a lot of pushback from colleagues about enabling this student. And for me, I heard, I feel safe in your room. And so I sort of went to bat for this student. Many years later, within the last couple of years, we met for lunch and they disclosed to me that they were suicidal and that just being able to be in my classroom during high school had literally saved their life. And so I think that this is just something that we need to think about, being intentional and welcoming all students into our space. And with that, I will hand it over to James.
Okay. Did you want to do your announcement for Thursday, or do you want to do that at the end?
Let's do it now. Okay. We are having a special Q&A session, a community of practice from 1 to 2. Many of you would have gotten an email already about this, but you're probably getting 7,000 emails a day right now. So I just wanted to announce that. It is posted on the website, and this is just a general Q&A to see what you need right now and to share our training calendar with you for the rest of the next 5 or so weeks as we plan them, and then to adjust as needed as you give us input. Okay, any questions about that? We will post it, we will send out reminders, and we will hopefully see you Thursday as well.
All right. Well, thanks, Michelle. I'm really excited to be here. This is a issue near dear to my heart as well. I am a member of the LGBT community, so this is just something inherent to me, and wanting to be supportive of youth that may be experiencing the same thing that I experienced growing up, coming to terms about my sexual orientation and whatnot in high school. And I know that this is still an issue for a lot of students, and it varies across locations, it varies across sites. And so I know that each of you who are working with students are going to have a very different experience. It's going to be very individualized. And so I'm hoping with the information I'm presenting here today can just kind of help you guide your own practice moving forward. I do want to start the day off with kind of some basic definitions. I would like to just make sure that everybody's kind of on the same track, and you may kind of think, oh, I keep hearing all these terms, there's all these things that I don't understand, or they're ever evolving. And so I just kind of want to get us on the same page with that and provide you some resources and visualizations. I'll move into our lecture kind of with this theme of intersectionality, and I'll define what that is and why that's important to understand when working with different youth who may be LGBT, who also have a disability, who also experience a disability. I'll specifically talk about a few research studies. One was with LGBTQ youth who had a disability and their experience in the transition process, and then considerations for career development. So I know that you all are working with individuals as they're trying to make plans for the future. And so I kind of wanted to give you some insights from a study that kind of talked about what it means to have these intersecting identities while at work. So maybe you could kind of foreshadow to the students, and then we'll end with some resources and what you could do and some practices. And hopefully that will kind of give us a kind of round, robust, but not super intricate, super researchy presentation for today. Michelle, and there's a whole team working, looking at the chat, looking at different things. So please utilize that. I'm happy to be interrupted to answer a question if something's not clear. And hopefully we'll have time at the end for some questions as well. So I'm just going to get us started here. Our first thing is the definition. One thing, this is not from a research paper, this is just my own observation and probably something that you've experienced as well, but the terminology that we use to describe individuals just continues to change and evolve. You know, this is something that new identities come around, people are describing themselves in different ways. And so I just want to kind of put that preface out there. I'm going to give you some terms to kind of think about. We have a specific resource from SAMHSA around what all these different terminology is, because there's so many. I'm not going to go into all the details, but it's a resource for you to look at. And to, if you hear a student say one thing, you can kind of look that up as a glossary, and hopefully you can understand what that is. I think I want to say a little caveat here when it comes to definition and terminologies. In my opinion, terms will always change and evolve. So when working with individuals with differing identities as yours, I think it's okay to make a mistake. You know, that's my opinion. I think it's the manner in which that mistake happens. And if you're sincere about learning about how an individual wants to describe themselves and kind of following through and respecting their own needs and their students' preferences, that's really where the follow through and the importance comes. It's not that you should know what these definitions or these terms are and you should automatically know how somebody identifies, but it's kind of learning and being willing to make mistakes and showing that you're vulnerable too, in learning what their preferences are, and then being able to follow through with that. So I just want to kind of throw that out there, just because people can be really particular about terms, and we just want to make sure that we're in a space where it's okay to make a mistake and learn from that.
Hey
James, we have
we have a quick question. What's SAMHSA?
Oh, SAMHSA. So it's a government agency around substance abuse and mental health. So I think it's the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration is the title, but they are part of the Health and Human Services branch of the U.S. government, and they put out a lot of resources for schools around mental health, around LGBT. They do stuff with medical, so they're a great resource, and they also have a lot of funding opportunities. You need some, grant connections, but if you're looking for funding around substance abuse, mental health, LGBTQ issues, they're a really, really wonderful resource. And if it's not, the website's not on one of the resources that I have, I'll make sure to put the website up there.
The website is in the chat now.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I'm just going to move forward here with our definitions. So kind of these are, in my view, kind of the broad range of what the LGBTQ community is looking under. In terms of sexual orientation, we're really thinking about a person's kind of emotional sexual attraction to others. So whether or not they're attracted to somebody of the same sex as themselves. So, and these are typically classified around heterosexual, bisexual, homosexual, gender identity. Gender identity is at an internal sense. So somebody's way of identifying themselves internally. So it might not necessarily be what is visible to the outside world. And that is different from gender expression. And that's really in which it's the way in which people express themselves on the outside. So that could be through their dress, through stereotypic body movement, through clothing. So whatever it might be, but the way that which somebody expresses themselves is gender expression. Gender nonconforming, this is where somebody kind of takes the idea of who they are, and that expression kind of differs from family or cultural expectations. And so if we see somebody who is presenting more androgynous-like, or who's kind of, in a sense, dressing in a way that we might not expect the typical gender to express themselves, then we would consider those individuals gender nonconforming. An individual who is transgender, that's a person who feels like their gender identity does not match their physical body. And so they feel like they're kind of in this body that doesn't present their true gender. And so those are kind of some really broad categories of something for you to consider when working with LGBTQ youth. There's a lot of different ways in which identity can fluctuate and change, and how people can identify. And this, like I said, the specific terms underneath each of these bigger, broader categories are in the resource that we're going to provide to you. One way that has been used across a lot of modalities and across a lot of settings to kind of provide more of a visual representation, and this is also a resource that you'll have, is something called the genderbread person. I think this is used a lot, but it kind of gives you a visual representation of, you know, how can I describe, or how do I know what a person might be going through? And so I also think if you're working with kids who are questioning, or especially students with disabilities who may need some type of visual representation to help them kind of think about who they are, or, you know, how they want to identify, I think this is a really user-friendly sort of visual for them to kind of look at and kind of see where they are. So, so again, you have this kind of idea of gender identity. So what is, how do I internally feel about my own gender? So man, woman, you see gender queer in the middle. That's another term that's kind of in that zone of I'm not one thing or another, I'm fluctuating. Gender expression, whether it's feminine or masculine. So those kind of fall on those gender norms. And then again, having that androgynous expression in the middle, biological sex. So that's really focused on chromosomal and any phenotypical characteristics that come with those chromosomal attributes. And then sexual orientation, again, kind of that fluidity of who am I attracted to, who am I drawn to. So, so I just kind of wanted to start us off with just kind of this brief kind of overview of, you know, who could your students be, you know, and what do these categories look like? And I think this is a really, really wonderful resource. So I don't want this topic to be unreachable, but I do want to talk about intersectionality, because I think intersectionality really is important. Intersectionality is defined as a way to explore the interconnectedness of different statuses in relation to embedded systems of power, privilege, and or oppression. No single element of identity, be it class, race, gender, disability, or sexual orientation, can truly be understood except in relation to the others. And I don't think that you need to be a theorist moving through or after this particular professional development that you're going through today, but I do want to kind of say that there's a reason why intersectionality really is important to a lot of individuals who hold minority identities or marginalized identities. And that's because their experience really is different. So a lot of times you can't just say a Black woman, it's not just the Black experience that this individual is having, but it's also holding the identity of being a woman. And so those two identities themselves have some marginalization, and putting the two together, I'm not saying that it's additive, but it's unique and it's different than holding one identity versus the two together. And so that's important for us thinking about our students, because one, we're already having to do something around disability, right? We're working with our students who are navigating self-awareness, self-identity with the idea of this is my disability, whatever it may be, learning disability, behavioral concerns, intellectual disability. And then they also have to understand themselves through sexuality. And so so it's just really important for us to think about what are the experiences that these individuals hold, and how unique are they? So again, kind of the idea of intersectionality comes with the idea that everybody is very, very unique. And that's one thing that I think is a really positive in special education, is that we really have been trained to individualize and to look at our students and support our students in ways that are going to meet their individual needs. And so I think that's really a benefit and a positive in terms of our field when it comes to working with LGBTQ youth, is we already have that kind of thought of this is not a homogenous group, right? There is going to be differences across our students and our populations. So I want to kind of get to this next slide. This research was done, if you've been in the state of Oregon and working in YTP for the past 5 or 6 years, you may have come across a fantastic, wonderful researcher and woman. Her name is Lori Gutman-Kahn, and she did her PhD and her dissertation on the lived experiences of LGBTQ transition age youth with disabilities. And there's really not a lot of research on this population. And so when there's not a lot of research on a population, we first start looking for research that is to understand the lived experiences. And so she did qualitative interviews with transition age youth. And in her dissertation, what she started looking for was, what are the issues that come with having an identity of disability? What are the issues that come with the identity of having an LGBTQI identified identity? And then what are those shared experiences that, if you had to overlap the two, what might come from holding both of those identities? And so, as you know, because you're the ones working with the youth, you may see some of these things and they may not be new. If you're starting off as a YTP specialist and you haven't navigated this world in depth, this may be new. But it's really important to show specifically around that shared experience, around harassment and discrimination, stereotypes and stigma. We'll talk about family isolation in a little bit more. they're at higher risk. You know, students with disabilities are already at higher risk for school dropout, but those with LGBTQ identities also are at high risk for school dropout. Low self-esteem, which is a contributing factor to increased likelihoods of depression and anxiety. So we see higher rates of depression and anxiety in both youth with disabilities, but also LGBTQ youth. Higher substance abuse. I think conflicting identity development is really an issue, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And limited role models. You know, how do we progress through life if we don't have somebody that looks like us, or that moves like us throughout the world, that we could say, oh, I could do things with my life. So this is just a really brief kind of overview of, you know, what this looks like and what those experiences as a whole, right? Maybe your students might not experience these things, but as a whole, in aggregate, we're seeing there's a lot of risk factors with holding one identity over the other and then having both of those identities. And so being cautious and being aware when working with our youth that what could be their experience, it's really, really essential to know. So I'm going to kind of dive into her findings a little bit more. This is from her publication, not necessarily her, this is from her dissertation, but this is published in 2015. So when you're working with youth, I think it's good to understand what's kind of going on internally when it comes to identity development. So when Lori was interviewing her youth, what became really important was three main categories around navigating this new identity. This fear of rejection, navigating normality, and then this positive beliefs about their identity. So we'll talk a little bit about each. So I think this is really important, and this kind of will translate, I think, and be something that happens, I would say, throughout their entire life. And that's, you know, maybe something that I'm projecting on some youth. Maybe that's also a little bit of my own experience. But when, you know, something is invisible and you disclose something to another person, there's always a fear of rejection because it's a little bit different. And so I think there's a lot of fear when it comes to, you know, when people start coming out, right? And so this was very prevalent with the individuals that Lori interviewed for her dissertation. So this fear of rejection from peers, fear of rejection for being different. So for many youth, they're growing up, this is also important to know, is that for many youth, they're actually growing up in environments where they're the only ones who hold this identity. So we may not think about it because we may say, oh, their family is accepting, or we perceive their family to be accepting, but actually nobody in their family identifies as LGBTQ. And so students who start to identify as LGBTQ, they're going to come up in a family structure in a cultural environment where really they're kind of isolated. They're the only one who holds this identity. And that could be really a lot of, that could be a lot of emotion on that. So, so I think it's important to, again, just be aware that even as much as you're trying to create an environment that they're not alone, you know, youth may actually really feel alone when it comes to their LGBTQ identity. Navigating normality. I think, you know, I think this can be a broad topic. It's something that everybody is trying to still figure out what is normal. I grew up in Southern California. I went to school in Los Angeles. And when I moved to Oregon, I felt like this freedom because I felt like, oh man, you know, people are pretty accepting and they allow you to be who you are, you know, but in Southern California, it was all about what you're wearing, you know, who do you know, what kind of car do you drive, and how do you create normality through these kind of visual things. And but even as accepting as a place like Oregon, or in our little small enclaves where there's more acceptance for LGBTQ community, students are still navigating this idea of what is normal, and wanting to feel normal, but also having to accept the fact that their identity may not fit into that normality. So again, that's another thing that they're dealing with, that they're seeing everybody else, or maybe perceiving everybody else as normal, but for themselves, they're trying to figure out, am I normal, or how do I fit in? And then the last thing from this particular study that I wanted to share with you is this idea of positive beliefs about identity. For some youth, they said that being out and open in all aspects of their identities helped them feel happier. And they felt like the more that they learned about their identities, the more positive they felt about themselves. So again, we're moving through this time where students are recognizing that they are different, or they feel different, and they're not quite sure why. And as they become educated about who they are, or what they perceive they're going to be, or whatever, the more they start to learn about it, the more positive they started feeling about themselves. It is interesting, there's a little bit of a caveat here, but positive beliefs were found in students that lived and went to school in more open and accepting environments. So, I think that there's a translation to not only being able to be out, but the reason why students maybe were able to be out was because their environment allowed them to be out. And then that allowed them to explore who their identities are. And this is important to note because when we talk about things that you can do, so much about what you can do is creating an environment that is accepting. And so I just don't want to say, I don't want to belittle the idea of creating a safe environment, because it's very, very important. I also mentioned families, and this is a big thing, and maybe this might be a little bit more prevalent for individuals depending on what part of the state you live in, and what type of things are wrapped up in politics or religion, or anything that could be resistant to the acceptance of LGBTQ identities. But there's a huge risk for youth who are in families that reject the LGBTQ community. For those who reported high levels of family rejection, they were 8.4 times more likely to report having attempted suicide, much more likely to report levels of depression, use of illegal drugs, engagement in unprotected sexual intercourse. So there's a lot of maybe potentially indirect effects in the future for individuals who grow up in families that are that reject their own identity. On the contrary, for families who are accepting of their youth who come out to them, that really does protect against a lot of the risks that they may experience. And in addition, it promotes self-esteem and social support and overall health. And they found that family acceptance is correlated with perceptions of being happy as an LGBTQ adult. So this was a study where they kind of looked back and reported on their thoughts and feelings. But I think that this is important because you as a YTP specialist or in special education, you are working with the youth. You're working not with the youth in isolation, but the things that they bring to the classroom every day, and that could be family dynamics as well. So just being aware of, how harmful it could be if a youth is being raised in a family that is hostile to their identity, So just important to be aware of. Again, that's why it's so encouraging when you have teachers who are creating spaces where at least there's something that a youth can look forward to. Okay, so now I want to kind of go into thinking about career development. Again, there's not a ton of research, but I thought that this was an interesting study, and I thought that this could be helpful as you as transition specialists are working with the youth as you think about placing them in different jobs. What are the experiences of individuals before them? You know, how can you learn from those that have done it already, and how can you prepare youth as they start looking for employment? So again, this was another study where they used qualitative research and they did a lot of coding interviews. But individuals felt like overall this need to build intersectional adaptation, meaning the ability to reflect and prioritize and shift the salience of their intersecting identities when responding to different environments. So the idea of having cognitive and emotional flexibility allowed individuals to address marginalization or stigma and oppression through their different career trajectories. And so the idea of knowing what my identities are, and this kind of goes to self-determination and disability awareness, but also how do my intersecting identities, how could they be impacted by my different career trajectories? And where's my flexibility in terms of not only behaviors, but cognitively to deal with some of the issues that may come from different career trajectory environments. So the research talked a little bit about needing kind of this social capital, and that kind of came into two pieces. So the idea is intrapersonal capital, so having the ability to use multiple coping resources and manage stressors. So when we're working with kids with disabilities, we talk about self-regulation a lot. We try to figure out, okay, if somebody is very rigid in their routine and something happens to that routine, how do we help them learn how to handle that change? How do we handle that stressor? And so the idea is similar in the idea of, you know, do I as an individual have coping skills internally to deal with anything that could be a threat to my LGBTQ identity? And, you know, how do I manage those stressors? So having kind of this arsenal of skills, positive self-talk, anything like that, that can help me get through a potential stressor. And then in addition, having this interpersonal capital, this idea of having assets that can help navigate the career trajectory that they're on. So these are people in their lives. These are family members. These might be people at work that can help them build up a way to navigate maybe a stressful environment or navigate different decision-making, maybe about coming out or who to tell or, you know, what to do in a certain situation. So we know that our students need to learn how to be flexible in terms of whatever trajectory they want to go on and how to deal with potential stressors internally and with the people in their lives. And then they also talked about, in this particular study, they talked about intersectional identity disclosure. So the decision to disclose various identities entailed a cognitive decision-making process that required participants to consider possible benign or hurtful outcomes. And this is a skill that we will need to help teach our youth, because when it comes to identity development, some youth are really gung-ho about, this is my identity. I found who I am. I'm going to show you my identity. And you're kind of disclosing via your expression, and people might not be as welcoming as they expect them to be. And so really needing to work with our youth who are dealing with issues of disclosure and the idea of you need to navigate piece by piece, place by place, environment by environment, and what are the outcomes. And so I know that could be really difficult for students with disabilities in general, but we are trying to protect them with a sense of, if you've evaluated that this is an okay place to come out and disclose your LGBTQ identity, you've thought about what the outcomes could be. So the degree of outness. So how many people are you going to come out to on the workplace? You know, who's the safe person that you can come out to? And then thinking about what those hurtful outcomes could be. Is it going to create more stigma? Is it going to create more stress? Could there be more discriminatory encounters? And so that can be really difficult, but trying to work with youth if they have a job, or even if they're at a school site or whatever, you know, how much of this do they want to disclose to others? And have they thought about all the situations that could come? And are they prepared for those situations? So, so again, I really wanted to kind of talk about what those identities were, what the students may be feeling and processing, and things for you to think about on their end, what they might be experiencing. And then I'm gonna just shift over to things that you could do, and then we'll have some time for reflection and questions. So, so I'm going to present a multitude of strategies and things. This comes from Dyson Thomas in 2015. They put together a really nice article, and I'm happy to share any of the articles with you. I've put together resources, but if you are interested in the actual articles, I'm happy to share them. But one of their first things that they suggest, these researchers, when they're talking about kids with disabilities and LGBTQ identities, is creating a physically and psychologically safe environment. SAGE environment sounds good. It's very wise, but incorrect spelling there, so I apologize. But so having a safe environment. So again, similar to what Michelle was talking about, but being identified as saying, oh, I have a safe classroom. This is really important. So reaffirming, reaffirming LGBTQI identity by having zero tolerance of verbal harassment, through bringing in inclusive curriculum. Now, you as a YTP specialist may not be doing the curriculum design for the class, but the idea of having and thinking about how to include LGBTQ identities throughout lessons or visuals on the wall, working with the special educator to be able to incorporate that. Through the promotion of gay-straight alliances, comes out a lot, but there are preliminary reports that gay-straight alliances do support individuals with holding LGBTQ identities and having positive post-school outcomes. Being a role model, right? You could reaffirm spaces with different visuals, right? So very common to have something like this hanging from your door. Everyone is welcome here with a rainbow flag, an ally sticker. One thing that I love about this particular sticker is that it combines so much of, you have not only LGBT or LGBTQ identities with the rainbow flag, but it also incorporates transgender identity with the white, pink, and light blue. And then it also incorporates this brown and black to consider others who hold non-white racial and ethnic backgrounds. And so this is a really inclusive flag that's been designed. Or if you don't want something that has a rainbow on it, there's ways in which you could create something that's a little less distinctive, but still showing that you are an ally. So something even as simple as this on the door could mean a lot to a student who's never seen something like this before, or they're the ones who are looking for a symbol, and this symbol shows that this is a safe environment. And these images I put on a Word document, so if you just wanted to grab them, they'll be sent out as well. I did want to talk about transition assessment, and this is something that you might be doing with your students, or you're constantly with your students. It's important, as always with transition assessment, to use a variety of methods to interview students, to assess the students. One thing that's important here is to try to develop your skills to not have kind of the gender norms associated with certain things, to trying to be gender neutral, trying to be culturally responsive, the idea of letting the youth kind of come around and telling you how they want to identify, but creating ways in which we don't pigeonhole students into particular things based off of our own biases or our own thoughts of what they might be doing. Another thing that you can help with is identifying community resources that are supportive. So, you know, working with your special education teacher, working with the community and finding job placements that may be supportive of the LGBTQ community, so that if a student is looking for a work placement, you know that they'll have a positive first experience in a workplace that is supportive of them. And then just working on, this is part of disclosure, but self-advocacy and self-determination, self-identification, all of that's kind of wrapped up in that self-determination skill building. Another thing that you could do is, and this I kind of put a caveat on if the student trusts you. And the idea here is you can work with the special education teacher on IEP goals. I know that you won't be doing the IEP or you won't be in charge, but you may be in an IEP meeting with the youth. You may be in a person-centered planning meeting with the youth. And so how do we use these documents to help expand and provide access to identity development for our students? So can you create job goals that are in homosocial environments? So if there's a inclusive bakery or whatever it might be that could support youth identity as well as give them the skills they need. The idea of expanding accommodation. So is there a way to say, hey, if this student is is very stressed and concerned about what's going on, they can go to a space that is safe, that is inclusive, that is supportive of their identity as well. Or identifying personnel within the school that the student can go to that is aware of their kind of unique needs. You can always help students join or begin a gay-straight alliance as a school personnel as well. Another resource that you can provide to your special education teacher is these comprehensive gender education guidelines from the state of Oregon. We have a PDF that will be sent out to the full list here, but these are things that, you know, the Oregon is promoting and saying these are things that you can do throughout the grades around gender identification, gender expression, and things like that. What you could do specifically is be an ally, right? So being an ally is active. It's not a passive position. So it may start internally by examining your own assumptions and stereotypes. It may be demonstrated through inclusive practices and language. So the idea of incorporating LGBTQ imagery and presentations, LGBT themes and assignments, etc. Speaking out, you know, that zero tolerance, and don't even assuming their disability or sexual identity is the most important piece. You know, there are a collection of identities, so that's important. I have this list of things. This was targeted for special educators, but these are things that you could do as well. And we're at 2:47, so I want to be cognizant of time. I was going to have us go through breakout rooms and to help us look at this and think about what our practices are. But I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give this 1 minute so you can look at these reflective checklists, and then I'll kind of wrap up and we can have an open question answer in the final 10 minutes. So I'm just going to give this another minute so you can look at these reflective checklist questions and think about yourself about what am I doing already, or is there things that I could do differently? So, so I think that this is just a really good starting list to identify, what are my actions? What am I doing? Do I have to change my behavior a little bit to support the youth that I'm interacting with? And, I think these are really great guiding questions. Again, this reflective checklist is going to be in the resources that we provide you. This is something that you could share with other transition specialists, things that you could share with your special education teacher. So we're going to move through. We're not going to do a breakout group just so we have time for questions and answers. But I do want to kind of leave here with some kind of things to affirm LGBTQ identity across the state of Oregon. This is a resource that Michelle brought to me, and I love it. It's from Oregon's ACLU. And this is also another thing that we put together and is a document for a resource. So this is important in terms of knowing students' rights, especially around LGBTQ identity. So does a student have the right to express themselves and speak out about LGBTQ issues? Yes. Can a student start a gay-straight alliance at their school? Yes. This is actually a really interesting thing, as the Supreme Court of the United States has said the students have the right to form these groups. And time again, that through lawsuits and whatever, this is reaffirmed. So knowing that the students in the state of Oregon have the right, if they don't have one already, this is a really important thing to have in your arsenal of knowledge. Do I have a right to assert my gender identity at school? Yes. Do I have a right to be addressed by the name and pronouns that correspond with my gender identity? Yes. Do I have the right to use facilities that match my gender identity? Yes. So Oregon, in terms of Oregon's education, it's very reaffirming of LGBTQ youth. So just something to think about as you are navigating working with these youth. There's a variety of resources for you. These are some online resources, New Avenues for Youth. This is a homeless prevention program and other services provided for LGBTQ youth in the Portland area. So there's not a ton in terms of in the rural areas, but this is important for students who are at risk for homelessness due to their LGBTQ identity. GLSEN, the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network, is a huge network for educators. So if you're looking for any kind of resources on the education lens, this is a really wonderful one. Gay Straight Alliance Network, building GSAs in your schools, and PFLAG, which is the parent organization. So in the slides here are the links to those particular sites. So here's my email address, jamesin@uoregon.edu, if you have any questions for me. I want to leave the last 8 minutes for questions, and I'm sorry that I hope I wasn't drawing it on too much, but hopefully this was helpful. So I'll open it up to questions, and I don't know who wants to navigate that or not, but I'll field them however you want.
Garrett's got his hand up. I'm trying to unmute you, Garrett. Let's see.
There we go. I got it.
Okay.
There's a longer question here. These resources are great for the youth that we serve. In our internet age, students know where their local resources are for LGBTQ+. However, my experience has been with the families or guardians of these precious youth. What can we do to build resiliency in our LGBTQ+ youth to deal with their rejecting families and advocate for their needs? Also, what guidance can you give us in working with parents and guardians to be more open to accepting their child? As this is my biggest barrier. This is a tricky situation. I never want to overstep my boundaries. My families are afraid because their child has a disability. They feel their child doesn't understand their sexuality and they're afraid their child may be taken advantage of.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things to unpack in this particular question. And so on the youth side, one thing that is a common theme for LGBTQ individuals is a chosen family. And a chosen family are those people who are supportive of their LGBTQ identity. And that can start with just friendships. You know, it could be friendships in the families of those friends that are supportive of their LGBTQ identities. You know, if they're in serious harm, then, you know, we need to follow mandatory reporting laws. But if there's ways for us to, provide them avenues to find a chosen family, that's really important. One thing that is interesting about transition age youth is that they are leaving, you know, so once they become guardians, they do have the right to leave a family. And I know that's hard for some of our youth who may be reliant, but finding ways to try to be independent if the family life that they're in is hostile to them. So that's something that's important to think about. When it comes to working with parents, sometimes it could be a struggle. And I think the idea, something that comes up a lot is that a parent who came out to, it may be something that they need to understand and take their own process of understanding. And so having a resource or having them the ability to talk with them and say, hey, this is not something that we're trying to say you need to accept right away, but it's the process of trying to relearn who your youth is and coming around and saying, this is just one aspect of them. This is part of the pie that creates them who they are. I think focusing on the student's strengths is extremely important and showing, you know, this doesn't necessarily hinder them. We could still look at their strengths and focus on planning for their future around those strengths. And that's going to be different family by family and how they look at an individual. And when it comes to protecting oneself, I think this is an important situation for all of our students. Something else that I'm really passionate about is sex education. And, you know, everybody talks about protecting individuals with IV from abuse. And the importance that what we don't think of is how do we educate our youth to understand what their identities are and to be able to navigate throughout the course of their life in the different environments that they're going to be in. And so that's the importance of creating LGBTQ inclusive curriculum so that they understand that when we're talking to you, you may actually experience more hostility than other people. And so how do you protect yourself if you experience that hostility? So there's a lot of, again, individuals, especially with different families, and trying to build and come around and say, hey, what are our strengths? What do you see as the future for your child? And how do we keep planning them, knowing that LGBTQ identity is just part of it? Is there support for students whose parents are requiring them to go through conversion therapy or conform? So I could be wrong. I could look into this, but I'm pretty sure the state of Oregon has banned conversion therapy and for individuals who are over, or for individuals who are younger than 18. So that shouldn't be something in terms of legally that a student would have to experience. In terms of conforming to heterosexuality, this is something where that flexibility of identity comes into, and I think this is important to play, and it's not necessarily fair to students, but it's the idea of code switching and the idea of not necessarily rejecting their identity, but trying to code switch and say, okay, while you're at school or while you're in this classroom, you know, you have the ability to be whoever you want, you know, but until you find a place on your own where you can be who you want, these are the lessons that we need to figure out how to get you through this particular moment. And again, it's not fair, but the idea of code switching is say, how can we have it so you could get through this tough experience, not necessarily conform to heterosexuality, but code switch enough where it's not a constant piece of abrasion between families and the youth. That's just an immediate thought. I don't believe that there's any type of evidence-based practice or whatnot around how to support youth that are trying to be forced to conform. But I haven't really seen many positive examples of conversion therapy, if there's any that are out there. So, so just knowing, you know, how do we support the youth through this time until you don't have to deal with that. April from Project is a great. Oh, we have Kia Swain said April Kaiser from the Shed Project is a great resource, sexuality training for youth in the IDD community. Yeah, and again, Francis saying, you know, it'd be great to be able to show people examples, and I could do my best to have that as a resource as well. We're at time, but I'm happy to answer any additional questions. Michelle, what's your typical?
We just wrap up by thanking everybody for being here. Let them know that we will send out the presentation and a bunch of handouts that were referred to within this. And please do stay tuned in your email for a link or on the website for a link to Thursday's Q&A, Community of Practice. Anything else from the rest of the TAP team?
If you have any questions for the question and answer for Thursday, it'd be great to go to the YTP website, and it's under Contact Us, and it'd be great to have some questions to start.
Thank you, Terry.
I just want to thank James for doing such
Huge
a
thank you.
job. I had the wonderful experience of having him come into our classroom a few times a week for a couple of years, it seems like, James, and
Yeah.
and just, you know, just his acceptance and working with kids is, love it.
Thanks, Mary Jo. Yeah, and I just please extend, you know, feel free to contact me with any questions that you have in the future. I'm definitely a resource. This is I love the state of Oregon, and I'm trying to reach out to and make my connections and be a resource for transition at the U of O. So please, please know that you have a friend there, and if you need something, please reach out to me. All right. Well, thank you all so much. I think I'm in charge of this, so I think I'm going to end the meeting. So
Thank you.
thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. Bye. See you.